Welcome to the School of Batman, a podcast where we ask academics to help Batman fight crime using their research. I'm your host, Chris George, amateur scientist and professional Batman enthusiast. In today's episode, we'll be discussing Mr. Freeze and the Avalanche. We're pleased to be joined by Adam Booth, who has a PhD in near-surface geophysics from the University of Leeds and is currently a lecturer in exploration geophysics at the University of Leeds. So Adam, we like to start the podcast with a little bit of background on yourself, your academic journey, how you got to where you are today, and what is it you're studying and what is it you're teaching at the moment. So yeah, tell us about yourself.
So I guess like with so many kids, I got fired up by dinosaurs and the world that goes along with them. So the very dynamic Earth that they lived in. So the volcanoes and the earthquakes and the catastrophic asteroid impacts and things like that.
What was your favourite dinosaur and why?
I think my favourite was probably the Diplodocus, just because it's so massive and it's so weird. T-Rex, it doesn't look that different from a lizard today, I guess. But Diplodocus, Brontosaurus, wow, there's nothing like that around today. So, yeah, the bigger the better.
Amazing. Carry on.
So then my interest, I guess, started to move a bit more in the geological direction, and I can definitely remember sitting on the perimeter of my parents' garden, playing around with the gravel and trying to classify the stones and things like that, which I think was probably a bit of a blinding way of my mum and dad to keep me occupied for a few hours on a Saturday afternoon. But yeah, I just started to get interested in rocks and the earth at an early age. But it was only at university when looking for, or rather in the run-up to university when looking for courses to take, that I became aware of geophysics as a subject and something I could get interested in. There's a link to earthquakes and volcanoes and the study of the earth.
So could you give us a brief explanation of what geophysics is?
So in general, geophysics is the study of the earth, the use of physical principles to image and to characterize the structure of the earth. My own field is in near-surface geophysics. So whilst you get some geophysicists who will look at the entire planetary scale structure, I'm much more involved these days with looking at the structure of the material rather closer to the ground surface, so almost immediately beneath your feet.
So what kind of distances would we be talking about here?
So that's an interesting question, because one person's near surface is another person's very deep. One definition of the near surface is structures that are somehow in the zone of human interaction. So subsurfaces that are going to be engineered for some purpose, archaeological type situations, snow and ice. Anything really within the upper 100 metres. Now, of course, glaciers can be much thicker than 100 metres and they sort of break that guideline, but that's the kind of range that we're talking about. Right,
and is near-surface geophysics and exploration geophysics roughly the same thing, or is one a more applied branch of a theoretical side?
No, I guess they're the same thing. I mean, exploration geophysics almost suggests that you're trying to find something. There is actually something to be explored for, and the classic application of this would be in the oil industry or in the mining industry for resources. But near-surface geophysics, I guess, is the characterization of the subsurface without necessarily trying to find something. Just looking at its background properties and how it's going to respond under different sorts of conditions.
Fantastic. And do you have any specific areas that you're looking into at the moment?
At the moment, I do a lot of work into characterising glaciers and ice. I have some ongoing research at the moment looking at the internal structure of Antarctica's Larsen C ice shelf. Now, Larsen C hit the headlines last year after it carved off one of the biggest icebergs that we've ever seen. And so we were asking questions about how is the remaining ice shelf going to respond to losing so much ice in one go? Are there going to be new sets of fractures that open up within it? Is it going to change its stress response and its flow regime? So in November, I got some funding and sent a team down to instrument part of Larsen C ice shelf, and at the moment we're processing up the data from that right now.
I've never really thought about what happens to the ice shelf that gets left behind. Could you give us a brief definition of what an ice shelf is?
Sure. So an ice shelf is the floating extension of a terrestrial glacier. So the vast majority of glaciers worldwide sit on some sort of bedrock of one sort or another. But under some conditions, rather than carving off into a series of icebergs when they reach the sea, the glacier will actually extend out as a floating tongue over the ocean, and that's what we call an ice shelf.
Okay, so this isn't connected to any body of land. This is a purely ice kind of entity?
It's connected to a land-based glacier, so I guess in that sense it does have a terrestrial contact, and that's the real important role that ice shelves have to play, in that processes that happen on the ice shelf themselves can be felt further upstream by the terrestrial ice. So, for example, if there is a large stress response on the Larsen C ice shelf, then the ice on the Antarctic Peninsula may well feel the effect of that in several years' time.
So I'm just trying to visualise this a little bit in my head, and what I've got in my head is an ice block where you chip something off one side, and that chipping thus causes fractures to go across the whole body of the ice block. Is that what we're looking at here, but on a much larger scale, how the kind of an impact on one side or an event can go through the whole being of the entity?
Yeah, that's right. So it's all tied up with this concept of backstress. What that is that the floating section of the glacier, the ice shelf, is understood to sort of hold back the terrestrial ice, almost like a cork in the bottle. But if you were to start removing the ice shelf, then it's not going to provide quite so much of that backstress. And eventually, if you were to remove the entire ice shelf, the risk is that suddenly the terrestrial part of the glaciers speed up and they start delivering more of their ice into the oceans. That's when you get exacerbated sea level rise. So we're interested to see the sorts of rates and responses that the fracturing of this iceberg from the Larsen C, how that fracture then propagates back up through the ice shelf. We'd hope to be able to model what the future of the ice shelf is going to be, and for that we need in situ geophysical measurements.
Right, so this is kind of a vicious circle in a way, is that the more ice that comes off the ice shelf, the faster that can potentially cause more ice to come off at a later date. It's not a flat line, are you saying?
That's right, so there's a positive feedback. The real risk for sea level rise is that if the terrestrial glaciers start to put more of their ice into the oceans, you get runaway effects. The ice of the Larsen C isn't contributing anything at the moment to sea level rise because it's already in the sea. But if you were to remove the backstress that it represents, that's where potentially you're going to see accelerated mass input to the oceans from those terrestrial glaciers.
Well, on that very fun note, I think I'm going to awkwardly segue into your Batman story. So, before we start, which Batman actor have you chosen to represent your Batman in your story?
I've chosen Adam West.
Great, a very good juxtaposition there as well. Was Adam West a childhood favourite of yours, or what made you choose Adam?
Yeah, I mean, I remember sat watching the old Batman shows on Saturday morning, and I don't know, it seems to me that compared to the modern day Batman, Adam West lives in a rather more naive time, and that's the kind of thing that I might like to be involved with, rather than, we're interested in catching lower scale villains and bank robbers and things like this, and not people who want to upend society and give power back to the people and that sort of stuff like that. I want to live in the calmer world.
Do you think your work has any influence on that decision?
Geophysics is a very uncertain field. We deal with a lot of ambiguity. I mean, if you imagine you're trying to image something at 100 meters away from you when you're stood at the ground surface, then there's a little bit of uncertainty that you have to accept when making that decision. So I think if we were really talking about a life or death situation for the entire of Gotham City, then I might not like to rely entirely on the geophysical imaging I could provide.
Fantastic. Batman and Robin are on the hunt for Mr. Freeze following his recent escape from Arkham. Wayne Tech satellites have tracked his location to deep in the Rocky Mountains. As our heroes leave immediately in the Batcopter, as they near the base, they are greeted by far more resistance than anticipated, as surface-to-air missiles pepper the skies. Robin exits in a parachute to pursue on the ground, as Batman twists and turns to avert disaster in the skies. One of the errant missiles crashes into the mountains behind them, causing a flash avalanche, covering Robin in snow. How can our hero be saved? So yeah, how can our hero be saved? I mean, I guess the first thing Batman's going to have to do is take those missiles out with his anti-missile repellent bat spray. But we've got Robin covered under an avalanche here, and no real way to find him. Can you help, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big applications of radar within glaciology is quite large-scale airborne survey. So the entire Antarctic continent, the entire of Greenland has been mapped using airborne radar. So you have your aircraft, you have the radar antennas positioned underneath the wings. The airplane flies around and you map the glacier structure as you go.
Glaciology is one of the coolest words I've heard. No, pun definitely intended. Is glaciology simply the study of glaciers?
Yeah, so the study of glaciers, the study of snow processes.
So you were saying radar is used to map, is that landscapes, like the topography of these type of areas, to build 3D models? How does a radar map?
So the radar works by, it fires off pulses of radio wave energy, much like a sonar. And in fact, this is why it speaks so closely to Batman, because it's kind of the same sort of technology that bats use for echolocation. These pulses of radio wave energy will travel through the ground, and they will reflect where you get contrasts in the electromagnetic structure. So certainly at the base of the glacier, you'd expect to get a big reflection there. And that information is, as you say, really useful for building up topographic maps and 3D models of the ice volume and the ice structure. What we then do with that is there'll be various computational models that need to know the subglacial topography. They will then predict how ice will evolve over time under different climate scenarios. But glaciers also have a lot of internal structure, and so there can be layers and contrasts within the glacier itself, and they can tell you a lot about the processes that the glacier is undergoing. So as well as looking at the overall bigger picture, there are subtleties to be found within the glacier as well that can highlight some interesting features of glacier flow.
Right, so that seems all well and good for existing structures, but this is, for all intents and purposes, an entirely new structure. The landscape has changed, an avalanche has occurred, and we're trying to find a robin in a haystack. So how would that same technology be applied here?
Your typical ice sheet radar has rather low frequency, so it doesn't see things with a lot of detail, but it does see very deep into the ground. If we increase the frequency of our radar energy, then we don't get so deep into the ground, but we can see structure within the ground with a lot more detail. So if you imagine that we've got poor old Robin and less poor old Mr. Freeze somewhere down there within the avalanche, Batman can scan the new snow surface, he can look for contrast within that snow surface, and if you imagine that you've got some sort of cavity in which lies a quickly cooling down Robin, Batman can see a contrast within the radar response, and that's where he could start digging and get out his toolbox and get rid of the snow and recover Robin. So
you said a couple of words in there that I don't think they mean what I think they mean. So you said frequency and contrast. So can you take us through what those mean first?
So the ground is full of different materials with different material properties. And the material properties that the radar is particularly sensitive to are what we call the dielectric permittivity. And this is a property of a material that relates to how electrical charge passes through it. So where you have materials that are juxtaposed and they have a contrast in this dielectric permittivity, that's what gives you a strong radar reflection. So the classic radar territory is to find buried metallic objects within the ground, because there's a very strong electromagnetic contrast between the metal and then the host material that it might be buried in.
So Robin's there in pure as driven snow, and there's really only trees and stuff around him, and he's packed full of electronics and metal. That's going to help show a contrast, and so we're actually going to be able to position him in 3D space, are we?
Yeah, that's right. So you have you've got the cavity in which he currently lies. You're going to get a contrast between the air inside there and the snow that surrounds him. You could very well get a reflection of him himself, but then in particular any bits of metal gear that he's got strapped on his body. If you imagine he's got hold of Mr. Freeze down there and all of the various apparatus that Mr. Freeze is wearing, that's really going to shine up in Batman's radar image. Right, and could you talk us through maybe what frequency means? Yeah, so the frequency relates to which part of the electromagnetic spectrum you're looking at. So at one end you have very, very low frequency electromagnetic signals. At the very high end you move through the visible light spectrum, through radio waves up into gamma waves. And the radar uses radio waves, so frequencies of the order of megahertz. And the higher the frequency you've got, the more rapidly that electromagnetic energy is going to get absorbed by the ground. So the higher frequency energy is able to see the subsurface with more detail, but it doesn't travel as far. And so if you are using a radar in a particular in a city environment, let's say, you might use a frequency of 1000 megahertz to find buried pipes and buried services, things like this. Whereas in the glaciological world, for looking through the entire thickness of ice sheets, you might be looking at the 5 megahertz range. So there's a big spectrum of radar energy that we can use, and that gives us a very big spectrum of depth that we can reach and the detail with which we can see the ground. Great. So with this technology, he should be able to locate him reasonably easily, and I'm sure he's going to have a variety of tools to get him out. But is there anywhere else we could use this technology in the Bat world? Could it be applied to other types of vehicles, maybe to the Batmobile, or any uses in the Batcave or anything like that? Yeah, so I mean, radar and radar systems technology has evolved to such an extent where it's sufficiently miniature, the data delivery is sufficiently rapid that you can mount radar antennas beneath vehicles. So in the world of civil engineering for railway track bed inspection, you get radars that are mounted beneath trains. You get cars that sometimes you'll see travelling down the motorway with radar antennas either in front or behind them. They are scanning the road to look at if there's any cracks or potholes developing in the road. The radar can report that sort of information. So Batman certainly would be able to mount radar antennas beneath the Batmobile and scan underground as he drives through the cities of Gotham. So there's obviously a lot of subterranean action going on in Gotham, quite a lot. A lot of gangs underneath the earth with guns and penguins strapped up in metal. Would Batman be able to build a picture in pretty much real time as he's hooning around Gotham in the Batmobile to be able to discover these kind of things? What kind of processing power are we talking about here? Yeah, I mean, certainly detecting the presence of things within the ground is definitely a big application of radar, and that is a real-time application. In the civil engineering world, you'll have crews who are using radar systems to look for buried infrastructure, and they will have a display right in front of them, and they will see a quite characteristic response of a buried pipe. And another member of the team will simply spray paint the ground at that location to advise, say, an excavation crew that there's something that they should be careful about in that particular area. What's going to be really powerful is if Batman builds up a time-lapse archive of the structure of Gotham, because then he can drive along the street one day, and if there's been criminal gangs up to no good under his very nose, he can detect their activity the next time he drives along the street, just by comparing yesterday's image with today's image, for example.
Oh, amazing. So that was actually going to be one of my next questions. Like, is there anything that you could utilize this in almost a proactive way, so you're not specifically looking for something at that point? So I was thinking more like, could you use these in a fixed sense, maybe in the Batcave to check for people trying to drill in or like to come in through the walls of the Batcave, which would enable you to look for people in a different kind of way, to say security cameras might work because you're getting full coverage or something like that. I mean, your idea was fantastic. Is my idea feasible as well?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, passive radar technology exists where you don't only have to be looking through the ground to use a ground penetrating radar. You could have the radar mounted on a wall, let's say, and use it as a forward-looking instrument. This has big applications in mining. So, for example, you get large mining vehicles that are boring out tunnels. Sometimes they'll have a forward-looking radar on the front of them to see if they're going to encounter any fractures, any change in the geology that could be dangerous to the mining crews. So yeah, I do think that there's potential for the Batcave to have radar systems mounted within its walls and give Batman some early insight into anyone sneaking around outside.
And in a slightly more mundane way, I guess, as well, he's got to be doing a lot of boring in that Batcave to get Batcopter tunnels to the outside world and things like that, and this kind of technology would help him out there.
Absolutely. The bigger the vehicle he wants to hide, the more often he's got to get his bat drill out. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want Robin driving the bat drill to get hurt. So a forward-looking radar on the bat drill is going to be really helpful.
So that's all for now. Thanks for listening, and thanks to Adam Booth for joining us.
Thank you very much.
You can follow Adam at GeoPhysicsAdam on Twitter. That's GeoPhysicsAdam. Adam is also delivering a talk on glacier geophysics at the Pint of Science event at the University of Leeds in mid-May. So come along for a cold one if you're interested. If you'd like to discuss your research on a future episode, email us at info@figshare.com.